Hi. So, with the coronavirus going around, a lot of people are cooped up. A lot of people are kind of going through some rough times. Um, and, yeah, a lot of us need a distraction, need something to take our minds off of it. And I spend a lot of my free time writing, or at least try to. So I've got this big backlog of stories, um, and I figure that's a distracting thing. That's a thing to take your mind off it. So I'm going to put these up here and share them. If you want to listen to them, put them on in the background. Sit there and watch my ugly mug read them to you. Whatever. But here's just a little bit of something to do besides sit and scroll through Twitter and read news stories about the coronavirus. The stories that I'm going to start with come from a collection that I call the Palouse Fairy Book. I spent a number of years a while back up in a region of Idaho and Washington, which some of you have heard of, called the Palouse. It's just this really beautiful region of rolling hills. There's a few mountain-like objects, not real grand Rocky Mountains, but significant ridges that covered in pines and Douglas firs and that sort of thing. It's got a lot of neat little towns, and I just really fell in love with the region, and so I was kind of inspired to write fairy tales about them. So I have this collection of fairy tales called the Palouse Fairy Book, and today I'm going to read you the first one out of there. There's a little bit of an order to them. This one's called How Fairies and Humans Came to the Palouse. How Fairies and Humans Came to the Palouse. When God made the heavens and the earth, he found a place far from the sea, where the hills looked like waves and grass rippled in the wind like water on the face of the ocean. And because God is a playful God, he made a second sea, high above the hills, invisible to the human eye, except on rare sunny days when the white-tipped waves looked like wisps of cloud against the clear blue sky. And God saw the sea over the Palouse, and he loved it, and he decided to give it as a gift to some lucky creature. But since mankind could not see it, and the beasts lived below, and even the birds must land sometime, he made a new kind of creature. He named these creatures fairies, and they were beautiful. They came in every shape and size, from as big and earthy as the hills to as small and swift as the dragonfly. Some looked like men, and these were called elves. But many did not, and they were the centaurs and the goat boys and the lion men and 1,000 other kinds of fairy, some of whom do not even have a name. Now the fairies lived in the mountains on the edge of the Palouse, whose highest peaks rose over the fairy sea like islands, and they named those mountains the Hoodoos, because they were magical. And the fairies built themselves ships and sailed out over the fairy sea, and men would look up in wonder at the bottoms of those great ships and their huge white sails filled with the wind. And when the fairies went sailing, a cold breeze would come behind them and freeze the hills, and the snow on the hills would capture the sunlight, and the starlight would be trapped in ice. And so the fairies would sail back over the frozen hills, scooping the sunlight off the snow and the starlight off the ice, and take it back to the fairy kingdom up in the Hoodoo Mountains, where they would use it to light their lamps as they sang and laughed and danced and feasted all night long. And that is how the fairies lived. In those long ago days, mankind did not live on the Palouse. They lived in the valley, close to the river that leads to the sea. But sometimes, when the weather was warm, they would come up into the hills and harvest grains and plants, vegetables and wild berries, and bring them back to the valley to feed their families. And so the fairies lived in the Hoodoos and the men lived in the valley, but they shared the Palouse. But, once upon a time, things changed. Deep in the mountains, down in the darkest valleys and deepest caves, in the fearsome Bitterroot Mountains of deep Idaho, in lands no man or fairy has ever seen, where trees choked the sunlight and stones blotted out the stars, there lived the ogres. The ogres were taller than a grizzly bear when it stands up, twice as tough, and covered all over in long, tangled hair. And that long, tangled hair, with all its knots, made them angry. They tried to brush and comb it out, but they had no light to see by, so they could only tug blindly, yanking out tufts of hair, which used to make them yell with pain. and the yell of an ogre will echo for miles and miles. But one ogre was cleverer than the rest. He was the Ogre King, and he had heard about the fairies and their ships that sailed through the sky, gathering sunlight from snow and starlight from ice to light the fairy lamps. But the fairies never gathered more than they needed. They never sold it, and never gave it away. But the Ogre King knew that if the fairies froze the whole Palouse all at once and kept it frozen forever, they would have more light than they could ever use, more than they could ever store away in their tiny lamps. They would have so much, they would have to sell it or give it away to anyone who would ask. So the Ogre King began to scheme a wicked scheme. He came up onto the mountainside early one morning and took his sharp ogre knife and began to shave away his hair. He shaved the hair off his big feet, and he shaved the hair off his long legs, and he shaved the hair off his big arms and his wide chest. Finally, he shaved the hair off his ugly, apish face so that the only hair left on his body was the big tangled bush on top of his head. Then he went down to a creek and looked in the cool, clear water and saw his reflection. It was still too ugly. So he reached into his pocket and pulled out a bottle of stolen fairy magic, and he sprinkled it on himself, and he became quite handsome. Deciding this was good enough, he traveled west for 3 days and 3 nights, and 3 days and 3 nights more, and 7 more days and 7 more nights, until he left the deep, dark Ogre Mountain Kingdom and found himself in Fairyland. When he got there, he pretended to be a visiting fairy prince from another fairy kingdom far away. Fairies always like to meet distant cousins, so they took him to the king at once, in his palace on the very top of the highest peak in all the Hoodoo Mountains. There the fairy king threw a gigantic feast, filled with eating and drinking and dancing and singing and stories and laughter. And although the Ogre King was the guest of honor, he did not like it very much, because ogres used to be very nasty and did not like singing, or dancing, or stories, or laughter very much at all. So he turned to the Fairy King and said, "Cousin, this is a very good feast, better than any I have ever seen in all my travels. But it is so dark in here. How do the dancers keep from bumping into one another?" Now, this was not true at all. It was, in fact, very bright, though not nearly as bright as the fairy palace is these days. But the king did not want to be rude, so he called for his servants to bring in more lamps filled with starlight and sunlight, until the palace was as bright as could be. "Is that better, cousin?" asked the Fairy King. "I suppose it is good enough," said the Ogre King, "but it is usually far brighter in my kingdom." "Well, I'm very sorry," said the Fairy King, "but that's all the light we have." "It is? Then the rumors I've heard must not be true," said the Ogre King, with a look of shock on his face. "What rumors?" asked the Fairy King. "Why, the rumors that you have a whole sea of hills you can freeze whenever you like. Why, if my kingdom had a whole sea of hills, we would gather light off the ice and snow for ages, and our city would be as bright as the sun itself." This thought had never occurred to the Fairy King. "Oh, well, that would be a lovely idea, cousin, but you see, there are humans down in the valley, and they like to come up and collect grain off the hills. You see, if we froze the hills all the time, they could never collect the grain." Now the Ogre King's wicked heart was beating very fast, for he knew what he must say next. "But, dear cousin, do they live in the hills?" "Well, no," said the Fairy King. "Then the hills are yours for the taking." The Fairy King looked confused, for this sounded very wicked to him, and he had never thought of a wicked thing. This was not because he was an especially good fairy, you understand, but just because he had never yet thought of it. "But won't the humans complain?" "Well, dear cousin, that is their problem. But if you are really worried about what the humans will do, I will tell you how to deal with them once and for all." And this is what the Ogre King told the King of Fairies. He must invite all the men in the valley to a feast, and when they had all gathered in one place, and had eaten, and had drunk, and had let their guard down, he must freeze them all at once, like statues, and keep them that way forever. At first the Fairy King did not like that idea, but the Ogre King egged him on. "Come on, cousin, don't you want to have the brightest kingdom of all the fairy kingdoms?" he said. "Well, yes, I suppose," the Fairy King answered. so bright that fairies will come from every corner of the world to see it, and you will be famous beyond your wildest dreams, the Ogre King whispered. That would be nice, the Fairy King said. Imagine. Your kingdom could be so bright and so filled with light that you will just have to give it away, and everyone will know that you are the richest king in all the fairy lands. At this, the Fairy King smiled a wicked, covetous smile and agreed to the Ogre King's plan. Now all this time there had been an enchanted rabbit named Jack the Hare, sitting just under the table from the two kings, eating his carrots. From the very first moment he saw the Ogre King, his twitchy nose smelled the ogre's smell, and it smelled like deep, dark valleys and cold, wet caves and nasty, tangled hair. And Jack the Hare knew that the visiting fairy prince must be an ogre in disguise. So he waited, and he listened, and his long rabbit ears heard every word the Ogre King said to the Fairy King. And when they were done talking, Jack the Hare hopped down from the table and ran out of the mountains and across the hills and down into the valley where the King of Men was fishing for salmon. "Your Majesty," said Jack the Hare, "Your Majesty, I have something to tell you." The King of Men looked up from his fishing and said, "What is it, Jack?" And Jack the Hare told the King of Men everything he heard about the two kings' wicked plan, and everything he suspected about the so-called visiting fairy prince. "Thank you for warning me, Jack," said the King of Men. "Now go back up to the fairy kingdom and pretend you never left. I know just what to do." So the King of Men went out picking apples. He picked apples from every tree he could find, and he sent out all the men, and all the women, and all the children in the whole kingdom to go out picking apples. Soon, they had buckets and barrels and cartloads of apples, all picked and gathered in one place. Then, when the messenger came from the Fairy King to invite them all to the feast, they loaded the apples up in wagons and drove up north to the Fairy Kingdom. The Fairy King told no one what he planned to do. He was becoming very foolish, as well as very wicked, and thought that he could simply freeze the humans and explain afterwards. Then he thought all the fairies would thank him for winning them the whole Palouse and a limitless supply of light. So, when at last the humans arrived at the feast, the fairies were all happy to see them, and they were all happy to see the fairies. But as the feast was still going, before the humans had eaten and drunk enough to let their guard down, the King of Men walked up to the Ogre King and offered him an apple. Now this was a very cunning thing to do. As everyone knows, it is rude to refuse a gift, especially from a king, and especially if you're a prince. But as very few people know, ogres hate apples. They find apples disgusting and would never eat one even if their life depended on it. Apples are far too sweet. And so the Ogre King knew that he was trapped. "Go ahead," said the Fairy King. "Take the apple. You're being quite rude." "Yes," said the King of Men. "Please, take the apple." And the Ogre King shook his head. And all the fairies and all the men turned and looked, appalled at the abominable rudeness of the Ogre King. "Come on," said the King of Men. "Don't be rude. Take the apple." "No," the Ogre King shouted. "I will not eat your horrid, revolting apple." And everyone stared, with their mouths wide open from shock, except for the King of Men. "Of course you won't," said the King of Men. "You see, O King of Fairies, your guest is not a visiting fairy prince. He lied to you. He is actually the King of Ogres, and that is why he will not take my apple." And the whole palace, full of humans and fairies, gasped, and the Ogre King frowned. And when the Ogre King frowned, his heart was filled with such anger and bitterness, and his mind was so filled with ogreish thoughts that the stolen fairy magic would no longer work. And he stopped being handsome, and his apish face, and his wide chest, and his big arms, and his long legs, and his big feet all sprouted long, tangled, ogreish hair. "Your Majesty," said the King of Men, "this wicked ogre was playing a trick on you. He was trying to make you do something very wicked. so that you could have all the hills to yourself. I don't know why, but I suspect that it is because he wanted you to share your light with him." And the Fairy King looked to the Ogre King and said, "Is it true?" And the Ogre King snarled and said, "Yes, I knew that if you got rid of the humans and had the whole Palouse for yourself, you could send out your ships and gather so much light that you could not keep it all, and you would have to give it away, even to the ogres." "But Ogre King," said the Fairy King, "if you had just asked instead of trying to trick me, I would have shared my light with you anyways." "Well, I don't want your stinking fairy light or your stinking fairy charity. The ogres can do fine all by ourselves." And just like that, the Ogre King turned and stormed out of the palace and ran back home and gathered his troops and declared war on all humans and all fairies for all time. But while the Ogre King was doing all this, the King of Men and the Fairy King were talking. "Now, Fairy King," said the King of Men, "I will forgive you for the wicked thing you were planning to do. But now you know that the Ogre King is very angry that we have uncovered his wicked plan, and he will hate us both and declare war on us forever. This means that we will have to work together to defend our kingdoms from the ogres." "I agree," said the Fairy King, "and I think instead of living way up here in the mountains, or way down there in the valley, our two peoples should live together on the Palouse. Your humans will have the hills for all of summer and part of spring and fall, so that your people can grow camas, or grain for bread, or lentils for soup. And my fairies will have the hills for all of winter and part of fall and spring, so that we can frost the trees and pour snow on the ground and gather the light of the sun and the stars." And all the fairies and all the humans agreed that this was a good plan. So every year, humans go out to plant and harvest. And every year, the fairies paint the leaves and frost the trees and send the fairy wind blowing across the Palouse to fill it with snow and ice to capture light for the fairy lamps. And many other things happen between the humans, the fairies, and the ogres. But that is the end of this story. So that's the first story from the Palouse Fairy Book. I will come back to you very soon and share with you my favorite story from this collection called The First Rain on the Palouse. So I hope you enjoyed that. Hope it was a welcome distraction. Have a great day.